I'm quite fond of the 50 Ti class of cards, with the GTX 750 Ti and 1050 Ti being quite often referred as to cards that won't die. In this video, we'll take a look at the Kepler variant, the MSI GTX 650 Ti. Feel free to pause the video here if you want to read all the details of the video card from the GPU-Z window. What I would like to point out here is the supported DirectX feature level of just 11.0. It's the thing in the parentheses. This will prove to be a bit problematic. The DirectX 12 based performance rendering mode in Fortnite, for example, will lead to crashes, so we'll resort to DirectX 11 whenever possible. I wanted to use a previously reviewed card for context, but finding an equivalent turned out to be more difficult. The HD 7790 has more shaders. The R7-260, while having the same shader count, it also has twice the VRAM. Which then leaves the Radeon HD 7770. Same VRAM, fewer cores. But hey, at least it matches the theme of the GeForce. Another thing that these two cards have the same is the cooling system, your typical aluminum floor with a fan on top. This is actually fine for the GTX 650 Ti, and the card doesn't warm up higher than 57 degrees in valley for a delta over ambient temperature of just 34 degrees. And this is surprisingly good for the 110 watts rated TDP, 30 more than the Radeon mentioned earlier. The test system is using a Ryzen 5 5600 this time around and 32GB of DDR4 running at 3600 MHz in dual channel. I mean, we have to make sure we're testing the GPU here. Now, because of the limited DirectX feature level support, the GTX 650 Ti fails to launch some of the games, or exits prematurely in others. And since it's the first time reviewing the NVidia card, it can safely claim that this has never happened before. Cyberpunk 2077 is, surprisingly, a game that will launch and even complete a benchmark run. Granted, this was at 720 resolution and low settings, and the results are not at all flattering, an average FPS of 17 and the 1% lows of 10. Forever young, I'd say. As for AMD fans, they should hold back on their cheers. While the Radeon counterpart did perform better, 2 more FPS for the average and 1 more for the 1% lows won't make this game playable. I was pleasantly impressed by how Fortnite ran in the legacy performance mode, that is the DirectX 11 version. All three tested resolutions provided 1% lows above 60 FPS, my personal standard for multiplayer games. The average FPS ranged between 81 at 1080 resolution and 132 at 720. 1% lows ranged between 65 and 92. For comparison, also in legacy performance mode, at 720 resolution the rival card from the Red Team averaged 8 FPS lower but managed 6 FPS more for the 1% lows. I'm not going to call this a W for the GeForce card, especially since it crashes in the new DirectX 12 performance mode, while the Radeon runs okay. Switching from Unreal Engine 5 to 4, we have Terminator Resistance. DirectX 11 1080 resolution and low settings is quite comfortable for the GTX 650 Ti, averaging 47 FPS with 1% lows at 36. Medium settings is also possible, with the average FPS dropping to 38 and the 1% lows to 29. By comparison, at the same 1080 medium settings, the Radeon counterpart averaged only 32 and the 1% lows are not going to be enough at 24, not even for this slower paced single player game. I will call Counter-Strike 2 playable only at 720 resolution and low settings. The average FPS reaches mid-90s and the 1% lows manages 66 FPS, above the bar set for multiplayer games of 60. Increasing the resolution has the game somewhat playable at 1600 by 900 with the 1% lows in the mid-50s and the average at 78. Now, at the same 720 low settings, the Radeon gets a lower average FPS at 90. But the 1% lows is better at 71. Doom Eternal is not playable, not even at 720 resolution and low settings. The FPS for the GeForce card averaged in the low 20s, while the 1% lows stayed in the teens. This is what having an architecture optimized for DirectX 11 gets you. And while the Radeon fans will rejoice, cheering for the almost double FPS for both metrics, I'd like to point out that the performance of the HD 7770 is still lackluster for this game. As with the other competitive online games, the bar for Rainbow Six Siege is 60 FPS for the 1% lows. That is if you don't crash mid-benchmark. This then leaves just the Radeon card as technically better, but with the average at 48 FPS at 720 resolution and low settings, this is not that much better than the GeForce card. Calling Control as playable on the GTX 650 Ti is somewhat of a stretch, to put it mildly. At 720 resolution and lower settings, the card struggles to average 30 FPS. As for the Radeon card, it did manage a better average FPS at 35, but the 1% lows were worse at 16 FPS. Neither of the cards are good at playing this game, so let's move on to a title that should go easier on them. And that title is Overwatch 2. At low settings, the game is playable on the Kepler GPU at all three tested resolutions. The average FPS ranges between 86 at 1080 resolution and 167 at 720, and the 1% lows range between 720 and almost 140. At the same 720 resolution and low settings, the Radeon competitor manages only 145 FPS for the average and 115 for the 1% lows, again a bit slower than the GeForce card. Since Dota 2 manages to stay CPU bound even at 1080 resolution, 100% render scale and low settings, both cards will perform almost identically. There's little sense to then show two sets of the same numbers, so here's what the Kepler card managed: 157 FPS for the average and 74 for the 1% lows. Despite running Shadow of the Tomb Raider in DirectX 11, at 720 resolution and low settings, the GeForce card still failed to hit the 30 FPS for the 1% lows, my personal requirement for single-player titles. 25 FPS for the mentioned metric is not going to feel okay, despite the average FPS at 38. For comparison, the competition managed almost 50 for the average and 35 for the 1% lows, making this game playable on the Radeon. Borderlands 3 stays playable on the GTX 650 Ti only at very low settings, and even then, only at 720 and 900 resolutions. The average FPS is 51 for the former and 40 for the latter, with the 1% lows being 35 and 32 FPS respectively. At the same 720 resolution and low settings, the Radeon card managed a bit worse, with 46 FPS for the average and 36 for the 1% lows. Despite being the architecture that got NVidia on parity with AMD in terms of power efficiency, Kepler didn't get much love from the green team. The card, while being quite capable on DirectX 11, lacked support for DirectX level features higher than that. This then affected its performance in some of the games, having it run worse than Radeon cards that have fewer shading cores. Apparently, size is not everything, it's the motion in the ocean. I got my 650 Ti really cheap, because I bought it as defective, but soldering capacitors to restore functionality of PCIe lanes is something that I can do fairly easily. Otherwise, I need to pay up to $30 USD. Please do not pay $30 for a 650 Ti, 10 more will get you a GTX 960, a DirectX 12 card with much better performance. Now, if you happen to have one, use it. There are plenty of other games, not tested here, that will run just fine on the 650 Ti. I will only mention them on the screen without going into performance numbers. This video does have to end after all. Thanks for watching, I hope you liked it, and I'll see you for the next.